talk is about how we can be advocates for our old buildings. And normally, I prefer to sit safely behind the video camera and say as little as possible and enjoy the myriad of great speakers that we have. But today I decided to use this opportunity to speak to you. So it's going to be me welcoming me as your speaker today. My background for the talk is that again, Katie Adams, I am the curator and collection manager and organizer of the Brown Bag series here for the Tread of Pioneers Museum. But I also am a volunteer, and I have been volunteering on the City of Steamboat Springs Historic Preservation Commission for a number of years. And through those public hearings, I've heard a lot of comments that I have always wanted to address, but can't usually do in the public hearing setting. And so here's a way for me to answer some questions and also give some guidelines for people who are interested in learning more. And we can get into what being a historic preservation commissioner means here in a few minutes. But first, we need to learn a little bit about the ABCs of what is historic preservation anyway? What does that really mean? Because it's a program and a concept, actually. So let's learn a little bit about that. First of all, you all care enough to come here, so any answer that you would throw out is correct. But why do old buildings matter? Why should we even bother? After all, what else? What do I hear? I hear, why should we bother? Old things are old, which means they're useless. Everything has a shelf life. There's nothing beautiful or particularly exciting about that building. What else have I heard? This one sets me off a little bit. It will take more resources to bring it back to a useful life than it would to just tear it down. That one really sets, no, it doesn't. Let's look at the punch list to accomplish this. One of them is going to be much longer than the other, simply because you have to first tear down a building. So that argument is moot to me, and it sends me off. Also, sorry. If these 1900 buildings could go through one of the greatest modern technology changes, being wired for electricity and plumbing, then they can do pretty much anything. Trust me, no one tore down any buildings to wire them for electricity and plumbing because they were not up to code. We can do things with old buildings. Anyway, I'll move on. What else? Not all buildings are worth saving. I do hear that one a lot. And to that I say, all buildings have a story. We may have lost that story today, so they seem less important, but they all have something to say, or did. But there is a hierarchy and a priority list because it's true. We just simply don't have the resources, nor do we need to save everything. But we need to know the hierarchy and the prioritization of what buildings really do have those stories that we can maintain. So how do we get there? We'll talk about how to quantify that here in a minute. But basically, historic buildings are our largest artifacts, which is partly why the museum itself is so interested in preserving buildings. Again, they're telling us a story. They're vital to our understanding of history. They provide a sense of place, identity. They give us a consistent familiarity and a sense of safety. So what I mean by this is, think back to a building or a landmark that maybe you could picture as a child, and what did it mean? So for me, or here's an example that I'm making up. Once I see the little yellow house, I know I'm almost to my grandma's, right? Or once we pass that brick factory, there's only 5 minutes left. We have those kind of memory markers, don't we? And when those are replaced, that's when we hear comments like, I just don't recognize this place anymore. literally, you don't. You had these markers, these landmarks, and when those are gone, so is our sense of understanding our space, right? Historic buildings are fluid. They have the potential to be just about anything. They don't have to be used for what they were originally created for. They don't have to be used for what they were originally created for. We are only bound by our inability to picture something new. We're less bound by the building than our inability to picture something new for the building. That's where we need our designers and architects to think around these things for us. And last of all, I mean, here's where any answer is correct. They're markers of our past. They're these important landmarks. They're visual representations of the passage of time, hard work, craftsmanship. Come on, are we seeing that today? There's a builder from Steamboat Springs in our past. His name was Art Gumprecht, and he was working primarily, we'll say, like the 1920s through the 1940s, right? And he has done a number of buildings around Routt County, including the old stone church just right next door. And what Art would do is he would do the framing and the physical construction of his buildings in the summer, and then in the winter he would go in his workshop and build beautiful cabinetry, tables, stair railings, inset furniture, cabinets, stools, all kinds of beautiful things. So he would spend the rest of his time in the winter finishing the home and finishing it that way. We just do not see that kind of skill anymore, that kind of time commitment, and those detailings anymore that we see in those historic homes, do we? If you would like to see a little bit of his work, go to the boot fitting section of FM Light and you can see what I'm talking about. All right, well, what does this mean anyway? What is historic preservation? Well, it's not opinion, because then we just really wouldn't get anywhere. We all have opinions, so we needed something, a standard to measure all of this by. And what brought this about is in 1966, Congress enacted the National Historic Preservation Act in response to the nation noticing a rapid loss of historic buildings. And so this act works to save historic buildings because, this is very much a paraphrasing quote, preservation of irreplaceable heritage is in the public's best interest, and it affects generations to come, essentially is what the act is saying. So with the creation of this act in 1966, a lot of qualifiable standards came into practice for the nation to follow. So that's how we know what to do. They wrote it down for us. It was also during this time that cities adopted and created their own preservation programs. This city, however, did not. This city would not create a program to help owners of historic buildings keep their buildings for the public benefit until 2009. So that's where we're at. Historic preservation is an effort to preserve, conserve, and protect oral histories, buildings, objects, landscapes, and other artifacts of historical framework. It's a framework for planning and community development, and it's also an essential tool to address other community issues such as sustainability, because it's already built, economic strength, and affordable housing. So, we're almost there, Caitlin. How do we know what to save? The first thing is we needed a starting point at it. We needed a date to start with, and 50 years was the number selected. So that's sort of just when that word, even in my museum line of work, 50 years is just sort of the national standard, because you had to start somewhere. Does that mean that if something is 25 years, that it cannot be historically significant? No, it does not. There's other factors that go into this. Does the 50-year mark always apply? No, not necessarily, but it's a good starting point to help sift out other buildings, right? Yeah, that seems good enough. How do we know what to save? Well, we do surveys. This is the practice of going around and conducting research on buildings around the city and documenting it. The surveys capture architectural styles, dates of construction, and additions or modifications, owner history, geographic importance, identities of the structure. Oh, it identifies the structure, and if it is significant to the overall story of our community. If it is significant to the overall story of our community, we say it's an eligible resource. Eligible resource means that it is eligible to be listed on a local register. Specifically, mostly this whole day, we're mostly talking about the city of Steamboat Springs. So when we call it an eligible resource, it's eligible to be listed on the city of Steamboat Springs register. And then how do we know what to save and how do we save it? Finally is historic registers. These are a great way for us to document these irreplaceable structures, to pay tribute to them, to call them out, and most importantly, protect them. But, oh, and they're also a way to leverage grants, right? That's usually the first step, and if you want to be able to qualify for something, is you need to be on a register. But not all registers are the same. So some are honorary, which is still awesome. It's still just an awesome way to pay tribute to something. It's a great title to have. So the ones that are honorary are the National Register of Historic Places, super title to have, the State Register, and the Route County Register. All those are great big pat you on the back, well done, you are a significant resource. It's only the Steamboat Springs Register of Historic Properties that does all of those things and actually protects the resource. All right. I hear this a lot. Those history people, which is fine. Like, you don't need to know where everybody plays, but we do hear a lot of the history folks or the people in charge of this, and nobody seems to really know who they are and where they fall. So really quickly, these are the primary partners in the county. Historic Route County are really the historic preservationists. They're the ones that are actually practicing historic preservation. So throughout the whole county they work. They have the actual action of rehabilitating and saving structures, and they also do advocacy and education. They're an award-winning organization, and they have been saving and rehabilitating structures for more than 30 years in the county, probably. They're responsible for successful outcomes like Crescent's Market in Yampa, the Hans Peak Fire Station, and Saving Arnold Barn. So Kristen Rockford is their executive director, and the founder and rock, really, behind Historic Route County is Arianthi Stetner. The Trotter Pioneers Museum is an outspoken advocate for historic preservation. We provide resources and contacts for folks researching the history of their homes or historic property, and we help put people in the right places so they know who to contact if they're ready to move through the next step of the process. We also regularly publish articles and research promoting the practice of historic preservation. I sit on the city's Historic Commission, and Candace, our director, sits on the Route County Board that advises the Route County Commissioners on historic preservation. There's also Main Street Steamboat. They were born through the National Trust of Historic Preservation, and that's how the program was established, and they work to revitalize downtown buildings and keep main streets viable. Then we have, I just quickly talked about that, the Routt County Historic Preservation Board. Largely right now, they just review nominations to their honorary register, but they are looking to expand their program. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. And then there's the City of Steamboat Springs Historic Preservation Program and Commission. And that is largely, well, I'll just say this entity comes with a lot of detail and nuance that I thought we should hear straight from the horse's mouth, if you will. So the program is run through the planning department at the City of Steamboat Springs, and I am welcoming the City of Steamboat Springs Historic Preservation Planner, Caitlin Berube-Smith, to come tell us a little bit about the city's program and what it means for historic preservation. So Caitlin, thank you for coming and being a part of this today.
Of course, thank you.
Right here. Boop. Yeah.
Hi, so I'm Caitlin Berube-Smith, and yes, I'm the city's historic preservation planner. I also, in a volunteer role with a different hat, sit on the Routt County Historic Preservation Board with Candace. And again, our two registers are very, very different. So the city's historic preservation program technically started in the late 90s, 1999, in unison with historic Routt County. But we didn't become an official, what we call a certified local government, which I'll get into in a little bit, until about 2006. And so we didn't actually, similarly to what Katie said, cities such as Denver and cities such as Fort Collins and Boulder, Crested Butte, Telluride, Aspen, they all started their local city-run programs that have those teeth to protect the buildings. They started those in the 70s and in the 80s. So we really didn't start ours until much, much, much later, which has had some pretty visual and devastating effects on our community and on our built environment. So again, the city's historic preservation program, our purpose is not just to save and preserve what's tangible in front of us, but what's intangible, right? So the stories associated with those places. We break what we're looking at into different categories. So you have buildings, structures, sites, signs, and objects. So it's not just a building that we want to preserve. Sometimes it can be a cultural landscape or an important geographic marker or sign, such as the Ravadiers Motel sign. And again, we became a certified local government, I believe actually in 1999, but we didn't actually start our register of historic places until about 2006, and it was really built up in 2009. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means. So a certified local government is actually a program that is funded by the federal government through the National Park Service. And there's specific counties and municipalities that are endorsed at that level. And there are certain requirements that we have to follow. So we have to follow the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, and that act set out certain standards, what we call the Secretary of the Interior standards for historic preservation. And there are four main treatments of preservation that those standards provide a very broad basis for. The first is preservation. So that's when you have a building that is perfect, or a landscape or a site or an object that is just absolutely perfect in its physical current standing, and you want to preserve it in that exact manner. The second is what we call rehabilitation. So I'm just kind of going through the Secretary of Interior standards real quick. The second is rehabilitation. So that's what we would think of as some people think of it as a restoration project. So when you want to rehab your building, maybe you need to fix your porch, or maybe you need to replace your roof, or maybe it's interior work that you're doing. The second is actually termed restoration, and that's when you're restoring a feature of your home to a certain time period in your home. The third is reconstruction. So let's say that you own a home and you know you have a historic photograph that it used to have a porch, and you want to bring that porch back. You would reconstruct that porch back to what it looked like in that photograph. So what enables us to actually have what I would say regulatory authority, or to be able to enact protection over these important places, different than other registers, is our ordinance. So from a government perspective, we have an ordinance that lays out certain criteria we have to meet. We have to have a historic preservation commission that guides our preservation planning, that reviews sites of importance that we believe are eligible to be on the register. We have to make our meetings available to the public. We have to conduct surveys that Katie kind of went into. We also have to update our surveys. Some of our surveys are out of date. And then we have to have basically a legal framework to protect buildings. And our legal framework is very similar to many other counties and municipalities across Colorado, but it's also a little different. We can talk about that a little more. And the legal framework is what allows us as a CLG to enact protection over a building. So protection meaning if your home is on the local register, that means no one can ever demolish it, ever. If your home is on the local register, you have to follow a certain set of guidelines if you want to make physical changes to it. Doesn't mean you can't touch it. If you couldn't touch it, I wouldn't have a job and Katie wouldn't sit on our commission, right? You can put an addition on your home. You can change your windows. You can change your roof. But we ask that you do that in a way that's respectful of the historic character of your home. There are tons of benefits to being a city that is part of this CLG program. So we have access to CLG only grant funding, and so do owners of places that put their property on our register. We can receive technical support from the state and our national preservation offices. So that might mean bringing in an architect from outside, or having them review planning documents. Tons of trainings are available, not just for staff and commissions of CLGs, but also residents of these counties and municipalities. And then you can qualify for additional tax credits. So tax credits are a huge incentive in preservation. It basically allows you to complete a qualifying alteration to your home, let's say, and receive money back from that, from both the state and the federal government. And I think I've kind of already gone over some of the obligations of a CLG. We have to enforce law to be able to protect those important places. We have to establish and maintain a qualified commission. And we conduct new surveys, and then we provide for public participation. I think Katie's gonna get into a little bit about what you can do to get more involved. And one of the ways you can get more involved, not just with your own home, but with our beautiful landscapes within our city limits, and maybe one of your favorite streets that you love to drive down. When you hear that something might be happening to a home, you can come and speak to our commission about that in public participation. And it's really important to hear from our community members, whether they like or don't like what is happening across Steamboat. So a little bit about our regulation. So what provides us those teeth? We are only allowed to enact affect that regulation if owners voluntarily place their house, building, structure, maybe it's a commercial building you own, on our local register. And we talk about preservation ethic. So remember, I mentioned some of those other cities before, Telluride, Aspen, Denver, Boulder, Fort Collins. Their community members started doing this voluntarily 30, 40 years before we even had a mechanism and a route for our community to do that. So holistically speaking, we have a much lower preservation ethic, in my professional opinion, here in Steamboat. We're not as used to calling the planning department and saying, I want new windows, what's the best way to do this? I know my house is old. Or I have a growing family, we need 3 more bedrooms. We have plans for growing our family. We want to build an addition. They're not as used to calling and asking to work with us to best preserve that home. Of course everyone wants more square footage. There's just a compatible way to go about doing that. So we can only regulate changes to the exterior. So we don't regulate anything on the interior. We allow for new additions, roofs, porch enclosures, and more. We don't allow demolition, and again, this is just for properties that are voluntarily placed by owners on our local register. For those that are not voluntarily placed on our local register, so those would be what Katie kind of dove into, buildings over 50 years of age that we have determined as being significant enough to be placed on our local register. So we call those eligible resources. If you own an eligible resource, there are a lot of ways to find that out. Call the planning department, or your house might already be on a survey and determined as being eligible. You're still required to go through a mandatory historic preservation review process for any exterior change to your house, even a new roof. So I review those. And where some people would say we don't have as much teeth as other communities is I have no mechanism to make a homeowner follow our historic preservation design standards and guidelines if the house isn't voluntarily placed on our register. So my goal for the majority of the structures that come before me, because we only have about 42 structures on our local register, and we have about 1,800 structures across Steamboat that are over 50 years of age. So that's a lot of structures that I would review to determine, are they significant? And many of them are. So my goal is to work with the homeowners to try to get them to voluntarily follow best practice for their renovation project or their addition or their roof change. Sometimes they say no, and that's that. And that is how we at times lose very, very important buildings, such as the tugboat was just demolished, right? Such as I'm sure you guys have seen Lincoln Avenue change drastically, right? We have a lot of white and black buildings going up. I have had some conversations with the planning department. I said, we don't want to look like Nantucket in 5 years, so we have to do something, right? So even when it comes to the color of a building, we can't make them follow, one path or the other if it's not on our local register. We currently do have a 30-day stay of demolition for any eligible resource, which can be a wonderful mechanism to try to work with a homeowner to find a different path for that building, or to potentially move a building, such as I'm sure you guys know, the Marshall House was just moved. 30 days is a very short window of time. And it used to be 90 days before 2007. So So where are we going? We received grant funding for a citywide historic preservation plan. Most of the other CLGs I mentioned that might have a higher preservation ethic in their community have had a historic preservation plan for many, many years. We have never had one. We do have a historic preservation chapter in our area community plan, but that was written in 2004, right? So that was written before we even had our local register. So we are basically creating a preservation plan that will outline policy and code change recommendations, outreach and education recommendations, and then we as staff and a commission will be able to bring that plan with those recommendations to our city council for final approval. And then we should have a roadmap to improve our program from there. We also, as part of this same funding mechanism, will be updating our historic design guidelines. So again, those are the guidelines that talk about what's the proper way to look at rehabbing your windows or a roof, or thinking about bringing back a feature that was once lost. Those are the guidelines that owners have to follow if your property is on the register, and that they will hopefully follow if their property is not on the register. But again, it provides me and our community a roadmap for looking at compatible change to your building. So change can be good, right? So we want to make sure to help guide that. It's also going to include guidelines for buildings and structures that are recently 50 years of age. So if you think back, we are in 2024. So 50 years ago is 1974. So when you're driving up, Fish Creek Falls Road and Village Drive and Opry Skiway, and you look at some of those, what we might think of as more modern structures, many of those are 50 years of age or older, and they're very significant to our community. And we need some design guidelines to help guide physical changes to those building types and architectural styles that are so different from those that we see here in Old Town. So that'll be a very exciting project. And then of course, we also received separate grant funding. This is a great example of monies that we were able to use that came just for our CLG. So this is a CLG grant. And we're going to create an education, engagement, and outreach strategy. And we hope that it'll provide a roadmap for what is the best way to educate the public, right? Brown bag series is one wonderful way to do it, but it really shouldn't be our only option. And we want to work with the community to figure out what is the best option. And there are different audience types that we should be working with and educating. I'm guessing most of you are homeowners. Are any of you here architects? Raise your hand. No. Are any of you here in the construction and trades industry? No. Are any of you here realtors?
No.
No. So,
We have a lot of things to say to those people.
those are some very important groups of community members, local folks, that we need to educate about the importance of historic preservation. So when homes are put on the market that are 1,300 square feet, they're not marketed as, come build your dream home, right? So when a homeowner calls an architect and says, I want an addition, I want to pop the top, the architect knows to reach out to the planning department and say, well, let's work with the Historic Preservation Commission. Let's work with the preservation planner. Let's do this right. So there's a lot of education that can be done. Am I talking too long?
No.
Okay.
I don't. It's interesting.
All right. And raise your hand if you guys are confused or want to ask a question. How many of you all received or completed the recent community survey that the city sent out? Awesome. I did too. I didn't get sent it, but I completed it. I don't know if they wanted my opinion, but I gave it. I'm kidding. So I was really grateful to be able to work with some of our other city staff this year to get some very specific preservation related questions in the community survey. And this is a great starting point for very broad community outreach. So the last thing we would want to do as a city staff, as a commission, as city council, is to suggest a change that our community doesn't support, right? That is not, in my opinion, how you get to where you want to go. We want the broader, the most, different members of the community to hopefully, in majority, support where we want to go. So this was a really great tactic to kind of just touch on that. So the main questions that we asked, what's the overall quality and importance of historic preservation? And we had a majority, excellent quality, we're good at historic preservation at about 61 to 66%. What was really interesting about this is when they break down survey results for us, they do it in a very statistically interesting way that I don't understand, to be honest. It's very complex. But what this doesn't show were responses from people that said, I don't know. That was one of the options you could click. So for overall quality, only one person said, I don't know. And that was less than 1%. For overall importance of historic preservation, 11% said they didn't know, but they thought the quality was great. So that shows us that there is a big gap in education and outreach with our community. Very big gap, even though both scored pretty high, right? There is a question about redevelopment of non-historic properties in city limits. Do you support or oppose that? 82% of the people that responded to this community survey support redevelopment of non-historic properties. If you flip that question, in my mind, that also means 82% of our community in general opposes redevelopment of historic properties. Right now, have you guys ever, driven down a street, not here in Steamboat, and there's a sign that says, welcome to the Village Historic District? Mm-hmm. Yep.
Lots of times.
Lots of times, right? We don't have any local historic districts. We have one national historic district along Lincoln Street, Lincoln Avenue. But again, that's an honorary program. So historic districts are a great way to get more structures on our local register. And what a historic district would look at is linking themes between buildings, typically within a block or two. So we have wonderful commercial buildings along Oak Street. Art Gumfret, I always miss Gumfret. He built quite a few number of residences along 7th Street. The reason why we don't have any local historic districts is because currently our code requires 100% owner consent within that district boundary. Most other cities and counties that I would say have a higher preservation ethic have a much more minimum standard and requirement to list a district. In Boulder, it's 4 owners. You need consent from 4 owners on one block, or let's say a span of 2 blocks. That is a lot less. If you think, let's say you have 16 homes on a block, maybe 12. And your district encompasses 2 blocks. That's almost 40 owners that you have to get consent for here. In other places, it might only be 4 owners. And so we asked the question, do you support creating historic districts if a majority of property owners support it? And 64% of our community supports that. That's great. Do you support creating incentives for preservation of buildings that are important to our history that aren't on our local register? Again, higher than 60% support that. Developing rules for altering and constructing additions to historic buildings. Over 60% support that. Establishing a 90-day stay of demolition for historic buildings. Over 60% support that. Actually, interestingly enough, almost 70% support that. So that gives us a little bit of a pulse moving into these two planning documents, the preservation plan and the engagement strategy, where we can really continue to work with the community to formally recommend some very important changes that would help our preservation ethic locally and improve our program across Steamboat Springs. Oh, this is Katie. Katie has some pretty strong asks for you guys, and she's going to outline those right now.
Please get to work. Okay, this is like part 2. We'll see. What can you do? Which is the reason for this whole talk. Aside from joining our organizations, which we welcome you to do, and joining boards, what can you just do when you're out in the community talking to your friends? Well, we think a lot, and they're not really that hard to do. Speak up. So, the things, and Caitlin covered a lot, actually, so that will be helpful. But one thing I did want to expand on when we're talking about what makes Steamboat different from other towns that are similar to ours, like Aspen and Crested Butte, is the whole idea that things in the preservation world have just been going along a lot longer than they have here. For instance, Aspen has an annual awards banquet for contractors who do the best rehabilitation program, for the best rehabilitation project. That is bonkers to me. We don't even really have any contractors that live here that know how to do rehabilitation projects. We have even less who have any qualifications at all at working with historic resources or would even know how to go about starting the process. So we're just light years behind. It doesn't mean that we can't change it though. So remember, how many organizations did I list at the beginning? Like 5, right. Historic Rat County, Trout Pioneers. So let's say we're all the same people, by the way. I'm trying to give you an idea of like how many people in town are educated and able to sort of spread the word about historic preservation. There's me, but I also am doing 2 different entities. Caitlin is covering 2 different entities. Candace is covering 2 different entities. So really, of the 5 organizations, there's really only 6 or 7 people in our entire community that can help get people the resources that they need out of the 1,800 buildings in our town that are 50 years or older. This is not a wide reach. If only 7 of you here could go out and say some of these basic things that we're telling people, you just doubled our efforts. Like, that's where we're at. And it's not hard. So let's find out what you should say. First of all, you hear your neighbor who maybe owns a historic home. Oh, I think we're gonna get new windows. Just simply saying, oh, I recently learned that you should call the planning department before you get started with that. Odds are they did not know to do that. Odds are Caitlin will move it through pretty quickly. It doesn't slow down their timeline, but there's things we want them to know. Mostly, keep the old original windows. They aged with the building. Don't put in new ones. Anyway, that's a whole different topic. Windows are a big deal in historic preservation. So you hear someone say that, oh, I think we need a new roof. Hey, You should call the planning department. There's some steps that you need to take. Did you know that? Did you know we have a standard at 50 years? Most people aren't even aware of that. So that's the level we're starting at. It's just having conversations with them. We have a lot of those conversations. Trust me, people are much more open to hearing that information from their neighbor than they are from us. It's just vibes different when you're talking to a staff person versus your neighbor. And don't forget to tell them that we're so, what are those called? Complimentary sandwiches. We're so proud of you for having this resource. Do you know how much our neighborhood loves your home? You should be so proud. Look at how well it's aging. Thank you for doing maintenance on it. So always be sure to tell them that we love their gem and what, the efforts that they're putting forward, and then give them a little bit of help. Don't forget. Okay, so Caitlin just walked us through one of our important surveys. Filling out those surveys is immensely important. We did not get the participation numbers that would have actually given us even more information. So participating in community surveys allows us to find out what the community even thinks about any of this, but it also leverages our ability to get funding, to get the attention of our leaders, and to get work done. Fill out surveys. And when you do, rate historic preservation high. Just in case you didn't relate the two. Encourage mindful real estate transactions. We already found out that no one here is in the room is in the real estate business, so I'll talk maybe in a different tone about it.
Aren't you glad I asked you?
Yes. If I would run that different, but right now, and has been for a while, it's a seller's market. You can be choosy about who buys your home. Again, do you hear your neighbors saying, "Oh, I think we might leave in 2 to 5 years"? Say, encourage them. They don't have to take the first offer that comes in. They're proud of their building, or else they would have left a long time ago. Find a buyer who wants to live in a historic house. Find someone that you think is going to do right by your structure because that's the kind of lifestyle that they want. Do not look for someone who mentions that they're really just looking for the lot. And as a seller, you can ask them that. They might not be completely honest about it, but I think you can get kind of a read from people. Are you stretching or you have a question?
I have a quick question on that.
Yes, lady in the back.
Can you put into your sales contract?
I believe so.
If you have,
We should ask
people
Joanne.
would probably know that, but if you, so I guess the best practices would be to list your building on the local register before you sell it. That's
Yeah.
when you ensure preservation.
Yeah.
But then next step, if you haven't done that or you're in a family trust and not everybody agrees,
Yeah.
could you put into a sales contract that preservation of the building is part of the sale? And/or
We
the
think-
third level would be asking and making sure someone's preservation minded and have some sort of verbal agreement that that's your preference
Yeah.
versus an out-of-town developer.
Excellent point. Yes, I believe so. What do you think, Caitlin?
So you can put a deed restriction on your home, which is filed with the county property assessor. The home that my father used to live in California, he was just renting for work, but it's 1920s small little bungalow in Manhattan Beach, which is probably one of the last ones left. And the owner, who has since passed, her children took on joint ownership of the home. After she passed, she put in a deed restriction that her home can never be demolished or built onto. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to simply put your home on the local historic register, or you can also do something similar, a third option. I believe what the owners of the Maxwell Squire building did, they put in an agreement for the real estate transaction that the buyer has to be historic preservation minded. in any changes to the building. But again, that's a pretty broad statement. So you can do deed restrictions or put your home on the local register, so.
Yeah.
And I think we're trying to encourage people, owners now, before they get into an illness, family situation, if your kids have it, where there might be some sort of issue, to do it while you're healthy and while there's no issue and while you're not selling, so that these things aren't coming down to the wire at sale. Because even in the last 6 months, we've seen a lot of transfer between older to younger generations, and some of these things not in place.
Yeah, it's good to put it in place now versus waiting till it's in the hands of others, for sure. Because then you have no control over it, right?
Yeah, and the Marshall family is an excellent example of that. When I was speaking with the family, and luckily, through the grace, exceptional, kind of like Casey's Pond style miracle, we were able to save the building, but that is not typical for the past 20 structures. But when I was speaking with the Marshall family, it was that exact situation that Candace is laying out. Selling that house was never their intention. That was their legacy. This was their generational home, and it wasn't until the stack of cards started falling. So-and-so passed away, the next family member lost a job and had to relocate for work, so-and-so got sick. Selling it was the only means, right? And it was never in their plan. So they didn't have a plan in place, because why would we plan for that? This will always be, there are plenty of people in our family to care for this home that we love, and the stack of cards fell down, right? And when I asked, well, did you know that if you would have listed it before you sold it, it would have been protected? She said, I had no idea. I'm so frustrated. I would have done that immediately, and that would have saved it would have saved everything, right? So there is things you can do, and that's just one example.
Okay. So, hi.
Hi, Larry.
You mentioned the Maxwell building. Had those owners been approached about putting their place on the Steamboat Historic Register?
I don't know.
And
yes.
Yeah, because
they know it exists. Yes.
Okay, but I mean, if you cared, why wouldn't you do that?
We're not sure. Another great example of that is the Crawford House. The stone Crawford House, one of our foundational buildings from our foundational family, listed on the state and local national register, is not locally listed, and we know that owner is absolutely historic preservation minded and did a very reasonable and understandable addition to the back. So what's keeping someone like that from listing it?
Yeah, and I think some of the answer to that is that, talking to preservation-minded people who aren't listing, is that it's nuanced enough in their minds that they don't know what they would be restricted from doing, that they would rather take the preservation in their own hands and not be restricted by government, basically. And so they may have no intention, but the issue is, and I don't mean to say this like crassly, but like you have a heart attack and you're gone, and then your kids have it and they don't agree or get along. I mean, what we're finding more and more, especially with ranches, this happened up, with the Brown Ranch up in Clark as well, is, someone passes away, it goes to an estate of many different heirs that don't get along. Most of them want their piece of the financial pie and have no connection to Steamboat Springs. And so it ends up in a trust or an estate. And so that is why, we're trying to really, and same thing too with the Routt County Register. There are many places on the Routt County Register, I bet you if we pulled them, everybody would think there's a layer of protection. There's zero protections for every single one of those. They've got a plaque on the front of their building, and there's no protection at all. And then places change hands. There might be a plaque on it. It's sold 2 or 3 times over the last 10 years. The current owner from Texas has no idea what that house history is. what they want to do with it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of varying forces that are actually very much working against us, and unfortunately very little working for us right now, in my opinion.
That's right. And
think the
we're moving towards 1 o'clock, and I still have like 15 slides to go. So I'm taking this back over, but what?
I was just gonna say, Candace hit it on the dot. There are lots of myths about preservation, right? You can still change your home. And
Yeah.
I think that's one of the asks Katie has.
Exactly. So, but my biggest ask here that I've sort of, is this the right way to do it? Attend public hearings. So the Historic Preservation Commission meets the second Monday of every month, and let's circle it on your calendars. Please note, not all agendas have public hearing items, so save yourself the trip down to the Centennial Hall where council meets and check the agenda before you come down. You can also join online or write letters, but trust me, it's the in-person that is a lot more impactful. So come to the public hearings. We typically, the Historic Preservation Commission typically does not receive any public comment on any project. Aside from some of our preservation partners, that's right. I would say in 6 years, I've been on the commission even longer than that, but in 6 years, I think we've received less than a dozen public comments on anything. And I would say we've easily seen in 6 years, 25, 30 demolitions. That means nobody is coming to say anything about demolition, which means that we support demolition essentially, right? If there's no dissenting voice, then it must mean support. And that's the message that developers are receiving when they're there. So somebody is there, because they have to be. We can make them come, but we can't make them do anything. So they're there. The least they should have to do is to hear from the community saying, don't do that. Hey, I have some questions for you. What other means did you look into before you determined that you were going to tear down our public resource? Hey, did you know there's funding to save your building? You should be asking. Hey, did you know we value this resource? So when we're talking to an empty room and there's no one telling them that this isn't a good idea, they absolutely think they're 100% justified, and there's no one telling them any differently. So public comment is huge, and they should have to look at their neighbors and explain why they're doing this. Yeah.
One thing I found being here, we've been here since 2010, the military careers who've been all over the place, is that whenever they put up a sign, there's a scan code.
Yeah.
And you try and find that scan code and you try and go in. And
What
find
is
out what's
this
going on.
project about?
Elsewhere where they said exactly, adding this, demolishing this. So it's, you walk by and you know what's gonna happen, and it's kind of like, holy cow.
Yeah, we should do something.
But to try and find it through the labyrinth of the planning department is next to impossible.
Well, and the second layer to that to add on is not only is that hard to find, but with any sort of alterations or development, they do letters to neighbors, but if there's a demolition, they don't.
We don't have those handy dandy demolition signs. So,
But that's where it's always been exactly what's gonna happen. It's gonna be demolished, replaced with, additional floors going on, whatever it is.
yeah.
You know, walking by exactly what's going to happen, and that creates awareness. Those letters.
Right. So I don't have charge of that. The most I can do, nor can I tell you when everything is going to be. I'm not going to call each of you individually, but this is what the point of today's talk is. I'm hoping to start a grassroots effort. There are people in this room in our community that have enough time to send out an email blast. If I help collect the email addresses, we need someone to send out an email blast. You can take turns on checking the agendas. Here's how you find the agendas. You go to the cityofsteamboatsprings.net, and then you go down here to agendas in the minutes, and then you look at historic preservation, and then you open up the agenda, and you look for the word demolition. Okay? One person does it this month, another person does it next month. It's an email blast. Here's how we know when to come. I can't do that. The 6 people in our community who are paid to do historic preservation or not, or, professional volunteers. We're not running that. We're the ones actually doing the work. But it's easy for all of us to get together and start email blasts. I know, because you guys can organize book clubs, which are so fun and amazing. So the next thing that we can also do is, hey, by the way, this is also how you find everything historic preservation related to the city is on the cityofsteamboatsprings.net. Here's where you find the community development code that talks about what you do when you need to make changes. Here's how you find our community guidelines, and also not on this page, but similar, if I were to scroll down, that's also how you find our surveys, so you can see what buildings are eligible or not.
But call if it says it's not eligible,
Yeah.
because some surveys
They're old.
haven't been updated, right?
They're old.
So, call.
Yes. And then we'll just, I'll skip those. Boop. Okay, really quickly, let's talk about what this adaptive reuse is. It's essentially the same as historic preservation, but adaptive reuse is the process of reusing an existing building for a purpose other than which it was originally created. So the benefits of adaptive reuse are many. The old buildings are already there. They're already teeming with life and stories and detail and handcraftsmanship that just cannot be replicated today. Adaptive reuse keeps building materials out of landfills. Did you know that landfills have 30% are full of only building materials? We could probably reduce that. Here's my example. Take a look at these two Oak Street corners. You drive by them every day. They're about a block away from each other, right? So here is a historic house being used as an office building. Here is a historic house that was torn down to make an office building. So look, you can use old houses to make office buildings. You don't have to tear them down to make office buildings.
The Caitlin, the one on the
Look at that.
Katie, the one on the right was reused,
No.
right?
That was the one that
It
got
was
moved
relocated.
Relocated.
But what about Oak Street is now different that we no longer have this? What is this telling us about our town? Can anyone throw out anything? Like, what does that old cobblestone and log structure tell us about
Then I would ask you,
Oak Street?
where City Hall is right now, was that gas station 50 years old?
So we're gonna talk about this, but we can get into that in a minute. So does anyone have any insight on what this log building was doing for Oak Street? What does it tell us about our place?
It was a residence.
It was-
a residence until it was relocated.
This is where people
There
live.
were 2 applications to the county, 2 proposals to save it. One of them was Steamboat Mountain School, and that's where it went.
Yes,
the
and
other
I'm not saying that this
proposal
is
was
a,
mine to move it 6 blocks down Oak Street.
okay, let me just get my point across. I'm not saying this is necessarily preservation gone wrong. I'm saying, look, you can use historic buildings to be office buildings. I'm saying this building is now gone. We can talk about what happened to it in a minute. But the point is, it was telling us actually a lot about the block. And then if we look over here, what is this building telling us about our town and our block? They're different stories, is my point.
Part of adaptive reuse as well, obviously, all of the county's offices couldn't fit in that one building, but part of it is integrating a smaller building into a redevelopment of a whole site.
Yeah.
So could they have left that building there and had that, I don't know, maybe be a child care center, since we need child care, right? That the county runs, and then built that building around it? Sure, but it wasn't in their plans and it wasn't in their footprint.
And we never got to see kind of a design. Again, have designers help us think through how that might have been integrated. It's not really, I'm not a designer. It's not up to all of us to maybe think through that, but to put it out there as a challenge. Like how would this look? And then we can start to determine, oh, that actually could work, or no, even with all of that, maybe not. So I'm not saying, again, that things didn't go okay for this building. I'm saying, oh, look, these are two different ways. So other awesome that you've seen around our county, examples of adaptive reuse is the Granary in Hayden, of course, Crossings Market, and super successful project here in Steamboat is 910 Yampa. That's the old YV Yampa Valley Electric Association building. And I would say that is Yampa Street's most central and vital, most colorful section of the street is now that building has been reused, right? It has a lot of shops in it. It has restaurants and brewery and offices. So this was a very successful outcome for us. And the developer wasn't particularly historic preservation minded and was a little bit reluctant. But once Erica Hewitt worked with him, he suddenly, his ears perked up a lot because he received about $2 million in tax credits for not tearing down this building. And guess what? He's now one of the biggest proponents of historic preservation because it put money in his pocket and it's earning a lot more tax than a Walmart or a Albertsons or whatever.
And it
large
has a
box store.
Huge addition on it, right? Huge addition on it. So once again, you can have a historic building, you can get tax credits, and you can change it.
Yeah. So in conclusion, Caitlin's going to conclude, and I was hoping to have saved time for questions, maybe not specifically about your home, but you please do come talk to me later if you have specific questions. But would you like to conclude?
Sure.
Sorry for running a little bit late.
So again, historic preservation is a tool for preserving our sense of place, in essence. It can help with our economy. You actually increase the value of a block, not just your home, but the whole block, when you put a home on a local register.
Property value.
Yep. It helps with affordable housing. There are hotels in town that have been turned into affordable housing. Those will be 50 years of age soon, right? They didn't tear the building down. So even though they're not historic now, that's a great example of adaptive reuse, right? And then sustainability. The greenest building is the building that's already built. There's going to be some upcoming events going on. Community engagement for both the preservation plan and the survey, so I'm sure Candace and Katie will help spread the word on that. But again, every second Monday of the month, we have our Historic Preservation Commission meeting. And even if we don't have a public hearing on the agenda, but we're still having a meeting, and you heard your neighbor is doing something to your house and you want to know more, or you just want to let us know, you can come and tell us at that meeting, or you can email us. Or if you just have questions about listing your home, come and attend the meetings. They're very informative, and you can learn a lot. And then this next weekend, we are actually hosting the On the Road conference for the statewide preservation conference. It starts September 6th, goes through the 9th, and I believe you can still get tickets to that. And there'll be some wonderful tours. There's a bus tour that will take you to South Routt County. You can go to the Taste of Hayden. There's an amazing tour of Harry Mansfield. We'll be giving some local tours here at the Trotter Pioneers Museum, a Mineral Springs tour, the Veteran Center. Thank you. I knew I was missing a big one. You can go inside and see what the Vet Center looks like right now, which is really cool. And then again in 2026, I'm going to butcher these words, but
Try it.
I love Colorado because we created our own word for this, by the way, which I learned recently. So 2026, our nation will be turning 250 years old, which is our sesquicentennial. Colorado will be turning 150 years old, which is our semi-sesquicentennial. So Candace is actually, I believe, sitting on a committee that is helping coordinate activities. So there will be a ton going on in a few years to celebrate not just our nation, but Colorado and what Routt County and Steamboat contribute to Colorado. Yeah, so that's about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? Sorry I cut you off. I was realizing that we're 15 minutes over. But if you have any questions, now is your time to share or comments. Please do.